You might have had a friend recently tell you how much he loves his job. You might have recently heard a family member complain to you how much he hates his job. Well, today we're going to try to understand the Torah's hashkafa on this question. How much is a person supposed to try and be in a job that he loves and find a profession that he feels he's passionate about? That's the topic that we're going to talk about based on the Mishna of Ehov es HaMalacha. This is part of our Thursday Pirkei Avos series alongside my co-host, Tzvi Goldstein. Last week, we did an introduction to Pirkei Avos with Reuven Taragin, and this week, we unpack the Mishna of Ehov es HaMalacha. This series is sponsored Le'iloi Nishmas My Amama, Hen Yerila Bas Eliezer, whose yahrzeit is this week. Meir Neshama, have an aliyah. Before we jump into this week's conversation, a quick reminder that we have a quiet WhatsApp group. The link is in the show notes. We post bonus content there, and we're also working on some exciting new projects and events, which will be available exclusively to the community members who are on the quiet WhatsApp group. So make sure to check it out. The link is in the show notes. And now, here's our conversation about Ehov es HaMalacha, loving your work from the Torah's perspective. My name is Yaakov Wolff, and this is Starting. And it's an honor to have Tzvi Goldstein joining us as a co-host on this series. Welcome, Tzvi. Maybe you could start by introducing yourself to our audience.
Great to be here. Thank you, Yaakov. So my name is Tzvi Goldstein, originally from Chicago. Went to Yeshiva University and then made Aliyah. I was teaching in Yeshiva Kotel for 5 years. Over the past few years, I've been editing Svarim in English for a few different publishers. Now we live in Mitzvah Yericho here in Israel, and I'm doing a little bit more writing, some more editing. There's an essay by, I think, Emmanuel Feldman, where this from a bunch of years ago, I think, in Tradition magazine, where he talks about the importance of, let's say, high level or high quality writing, especially in the context of giving of the Torah. He talks about it as a form of Kiddur Mitzvah. His mashal, his example, is the name of the article is tefillin in a brown paper bag. It's like the same way none of us would ever imagine putting your tefillin in a brown paper bag that you take your lunch to school in, very nice velvet, and keep it safe with the plastic. So in the same way, the way we present ideas in Torah should be just as mechubad, just as mehudar. We need to make sure that we're not rambling or scrambling when we're giving over ideas in Torah. And I feel like my job in editing, what I'm trying to do is facilitate that for authors, for writers. Many of them have incredible ideas, but the presentation is not always so smooth, or it can often use some help in terms of polishing. So I feel like that's my malacha day to day, is the opportunity to help bring these ideas to the public, and as opposed to having them carried in a brown paper bag, to have them in a nice tefillin zekel.
And you've also done a lot of thinking, writing, teaching about hashkafa and how that plays itself out in our modern day society. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so these are ideas that I've been thinking about personally for a while, and these are also things that I spoke with Talmidim a lot when I was the mashgiach in yeshiva in that kotel. And the idea of, number one, synthesizing Torah and work as almost like two different parts of a person's life, but also much more broadly. Is there a way to synthesize both Torah and work as part of a broader, more unified perspective of Avodas Hashem? That your identity is not let's say, a Talmid Chacham or a Ben Torah who also works, but rather your identity is an Oved Hashem who does a number of different things as part of being an Oved Hashem. We're trying to go through Makaros and trying to develop ideas which let's say give over that perspective. So I've been speaking about these ideas for a while. I recently started writing about them as well. In the process of publishing a column with the Jewish Link in New Jersey and writing on my Substack that I recently started publishing, but trying to explore exactly these ideas.
So we've both spent a lot of time thinking about these topics, and I'm very excited to unpack them with you. So the first thing I wanted to talk about in this series was about loving your work. Now, this is a interesting discussion that is found even among very secular sources. And I wanted to frame the conversation just with one hafnaya, one ma'ar makom, to a secular academic article by a professor at Bar-Ilan University named Dr. Michal Pagis. And her essay is entitled Inhabiting the Self-Work Romantic Utopia. And she quotes a number of influential business leaders and thinkers that have all expressed this idea of loving your job, loving what you do. She quotes Steve Jobs. She quotes Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, who was a lecturer at Harvard for a while, a positive psychology guru. And obviously, there are many people, you look on any LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, you'll see plenty of people posting about how important it is to love what you do and you'll never work a day in your life. But Dr. Pagis also quotes some pushback and criticism of this idea. First thing that she mentions in this regard is the fact that, well, is it really practical to expect so much from our work, to expect it to not only pay our bills, but also to be a source of, as she calls it, self-work romantic utopia, where there's this romance and great feeling of love and affection in your work? So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is, do we really need work to play that source, to play that role in our life? She suggests that maybe this idea of loving your work might coincide and correlate to the decline in religious life and family life in Western culture. And therefore, maybe this idea of loving your job is actually coming to cover up for the fact that we don't have the same sense of love in our interpersonal familial relationships. We don't have the same sense of purpose and meaning from our religious lives. Again, talking broadly as far as Western society goes. So that's the other challenge, is that maybe we only really need to love our work if we don't have the love and fulfillment from other parts of our life. So this is obviously a big conversation which is going on many different fronts in the broader world of business and jobs and careers. And I was thinking about this topic and I was thinking, well, what does the Torah have to say? We have a very rich and beautiful value system. Does the Torah believe in loving your job and loving your work? Or do we believe that Parnasa is just a means and you have to just do what you have to do in order to create real love and fulfillment in areas outside of work? So I was trying to think about what the Torah's approach would be. And then it dawned on me at one point that this seems to be a very clear Mishnah, where Shmaya and Naftalion say, Ehov es hamalacha. It's a Mishnah in Parak Aleph, Mishnah Yud of Meseches Pirkei Avos. And when I started to look into the various mefarshim on this Mishnah, I realized that there's a very rich conversation and lots of different interpretations of what Shmaya meant when he said those three words, Ehov es hamalacha. So I wanted to learn this Mishnah with you together, Tzvi, and to really understand what the different approaches are to this Mishnah and what the implications are for what a healthy relationship would be with one's work. There are many different perushim and explanations and ideas that we're going to unpack today. But in order to keep the conversation structured and organized, I think the best framing is to use the Meiri, because the Meiri gives two explanations as to who this Mishnah is talking to. Is this Mishnah talking to a poor person or even a rich person? If the Mishnah is talking to a poor person, so it's talking about malacha as a parnasa means in order to be able to put sustenance on the table, to put food on the table for a person's family, a person needs to work. And that is the first explanation of the Meiri as to who the Mishnah is talking to. The second explanation of the Meiri is that this Mishnah is even talking to a rich person. Now that's very interesting, because if it's talking about a rich person, it would seem to be that we're not talking about work as a form of parnasa, but as something deeper than just parnasa. Now, coming back to the idea of loving your job, the second framing seems to be a lot more intuitive. If you assume that work is just there to put food on the table, so it's really just a means to an ends. And therefore, how do you love the means? You're really just doing it in order to be able to accomplish something else. Whereas if you understand like the second approach, that this Mishnah is talking even to a rich person, so it's really not just, it would seem to not just be a means, although we can discuss this and there's room to debate this, but if it's something that should be done even beyond the practical, pragmatic, financial needs, that might be a little more intuitively connected to loving your work. We'll have to unpack that a little more. And this is not just my idea. If you take a look in the Ritva quoted in the Midrash Shmuel, he says something similar as well, which is that if you understand that work is just for parnasa, it's really hard to wrap your head around this idea that you're supposed to love what you do.
I think it's also interesting that these two sides can almost come into tension with each other. Especially nowadays, one of the big conversations, especially in America, is the huge financial burden of growing up in, let's say, the standard in-town communities, or less so in out-of-town communities. But because of the finance question, there are almost certain professions, certain jobs that people feel pressured to take, because that's what's going to give them the amount of money that they need to put food on the table. So it's almost like the Meiri's presentation of the poor man's side, which is the focus on pronasa, might lead you in one direction. Let's say you're classic doctor, lawyer, software engineer, things like that. Whereas if you were living in a vacuum, or if you had all of your needs taken care of, the Meiri's rich perspective, so you might come to a very different conclusion or make a very different choice about what you would be doing as your mulacha. And it could be that one, you actually are more oriented towards loving than the other. So it's not just for two different types of people, but it can actually, these two different considerations can actually come to a significant tension and lead you in very different directions.
That is really interesting. And if you look in that article by Dr. Pakis, she actually points out that love is something that we're willing to actually give up a lot of money. If you think about how much money it costs us to be married and to have children. So when we talk about love, we're willing to give up large amounts of money, and work seems to be something that you would do to receive large amounts of money. So that is the tension that we have to think about when it comes about loving your work, is that are we trying to maximize for income, or are we trying to maximize for love, and what the relationship of those two things are. So as we begin to explore some of the many beautiful Pirushim on this Mishnah, I actually want to start with what we said was the second explanation of the Meiri, the second framing and lens, which is that let's assume for a second that the Mishnah is talking about a rich person, someone who doesn't even need to work to put money on the table. So what does it mean for him to love your work? So the first fundamental explanation comes from the Avos Rav Nosson. And the Avos Rav Nosson has a really beautiful essay here. And I want to read the first couple lines. It says as follows: Ehoves hamalacha ketzad, melamid, shehe adam ohev es hamalacha, v'al adam soni es hamalacha, shekeshem shehatorah nitna bebris. Kach hamalacha nitna bebris, sheneamar, sheishes yamim tavod, v'yasisa kol malachtecha, v'yom hashvi Shabbat l'Hashem Elokecha. So what do we have here? He connects working to Torah, because there's a bris of malacha and there's also a bris of Torah. And where do we have this bris of malacha? He quotes the pasuk, Sheishes yamim tavod, v'asisa kol malachtecha, v'yom hashvi Shabbat l'Hashem Elokecha. So what does that mean? What it seems to indicate is that just like we know that Shabbos is a bris, Oshi Beini U'Einechem, so too the work that we do during the week is also part of that same bris. We know that, broadly speaking, there's a mitzvah of v'halachta b'drachav, to go in the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And even more specifically, with regards to Shabbos, there's an idea in Masechah Shabbos that we can become shutvin HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'maaseh bereishis. We can partner with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the great project of creating the world. What all these things seem to indicate is that just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu worked for 6 days in creating the world and then stopped on the seventh day, so too we are tasked with a similar cycle. We are tasked with a similar responsibility to spend 6 days working to develop the world, to make the world better. And then on the seventh day, we rest, just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu did during Maaseh Bereishis.
Right. There's, I think, a well-known Mechilta de Rashbi that says that the same way there's a mitzvah to be shovis b'mulacha on Shabbos, there's also a mitzvah to be osek in mulacha for the 6 days. I think it fits very nicely with what you're saying. There's also, I think, a beautiful idea about the end of Shabbos. I think plays very nicely into this. The idea at Havdalah, we're basically on this transition from Shabbos into Chol. And the way Chazal set up Havdalah, we have two parts that make sense. We have the bracha and bracha and many brachos, especially important ones, are made al kos. Then you have the bracha itself of Hamavdil. Then there are two things that are added to Havdalah, which don't really seem to fit. There's the bracha of Borei Morei Eish and Borei Minei B'Samim. So I think it's the Gemara Psachim that explains both of them. The Gemara, the Borei Minei B'Samim, the reason you have to smell something, the Gemara says, is because the Neshama Yisera is going away, and it causes the sense of despondency or despair, pain almost. And in order to get rid of that, in order to be able to move past that, so you smell the sun. Some helps you to move past that pain. So that recognizes, or that kind of that recognizes the experience of Shabbos is so sublime and so special. The idea of a Neshama Yisera that we have for 25 hours is a beautiful thing, and it's painful to move away from that. So we have Borei B'Samim to recognize the reality. But then we also have Borei Morei Ha'esh. So the Aruch HaShulchan brings this down in Reish Tzadiches in Or Chaim. So he says the following. He says, "Mevarchen ala or b'motzi Shabbos lefi shebo nivra ha'or shalish." The Gemara Psachim and Daled. B'motzi Shabbos nasan Hakadosh Baruch Hu deya ba'adam harishon me'ein dogma shel mala Because Baruch Hu gave Adam a chachma which was a model of, based off his own chachma. Adam Rishon took two stones and knocked them together, and created fire that way. And we include Bori Mori Ha'esh in Havdalah every single week as a remembrance of, or as a reenacting of that first Motzei Shabbos when Adam Rishon created fire, when Hashem gave Adam his own chachma mean Dugma Shalmala, to create fire. We know fire is this kind of paradigmatic of the paradigm of the Malachos. So we were shoves from, let's say, Malacha, specifically fire, over the course of Shabbos. Interesting that we actually use fire to come into Shabbos as well. Fire serves on both sides of Shabbos. But as we're going from Shabbos into Chol, we're almost getting this reminder that don't think that the only perspective you're meant to have is the perspective of the Pesamim, where you regret the Shabbos that you're leaving, but you should also be looking forward to the opportunities afforded by Malacha, symbolized by fire. Also on Rosh Shabbos, we have the extra tefillah that we see at the end of Mara, V'noam. So Chazal say, I think this is brought down on the Torah by the Taz, that V'noam Hashem L'keinu Aleinu Ma'aseh Konena Aleinu Ma'aseh Konenehu was the bracha that Moshe Rabbeinu gave to Klal Yisrael when they finished the Mishkan. Again, Mishkan Shabbos connection is one that we know is very, very deep. All the malachos which were used in building the Mishkan were Asher and Shabbos, and now we're getting back into those malachos in Chol. The opportunities that we have to use malacha during the week, we didn't have on Shabbos, but we now have during the week. We get that bracha, or we remind ourselves of that bracha. We're meant to see the opportunity for malacha in a very, very positive way. And I think Shabbos really exemplifies that. Yes, on the one hand, we appreciate the opportunities that the heightened kedusha of Shabbos, but we also recognize the opportunities afforded by Chol, specifically through the impact of the malacha that we can do.
Wow, those are some really powerful ideas showing how there's not just value in the lofty spiritual state of Shabbos, but also in the more practical, earthly work that we're doing during the 6 days of the week. I appreciate that a lot. And just to finish off this idea, the Avos Rav Nassan also made this comparison to Torah. He says, Kishem sha Torah nisna bebris, kach hamalacha nisna bebris. So where do we see this idea by Torah also? So I think the idea is that Torah is also meant not just to be preserved in its pristine Masorah, but to be developed, to be Machalesh Chedushay Torah, to understand one idea from another idea, and to be able to apply old ideas to newer realities. So all these things show that Torah is also something which is given to us not just to protect and to guard, but also to develop and to add on and to be active participants, be creative forces within the world of Torah. So I think that's the idea that ties all these things together. And now, going back to the idea of Ehoves HaMalacha, well, it makes a lot of sense. If we're talking about our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our partnership with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it is expressed through our development of the world, our improvement of the world, our being partners in Ma'aseh Bereishis, so I understand that just like I'm supposed to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, love our relationship with him, we are also supposed to love and cherish the responsibilities that we have to uphold that partnership.
Right. Once we're talking in the context of Ma'aseh Bereishis, I think it's just important to note a number of Midrashim that use a lashon of, I think, Yisava LaKadosh Baruch Hu Shutfin B'Tachtonim. The idea of being a shutef with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Ma'aseh Bereishis. Maybe next week we'll talk about different ways that Midrash is taken. Yeah, I think that there's two very important derachim that one Maimer Chazal is taken in, but at least according to one approach, it's taken in a very real, let's say, practical sense. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the shutfus that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is that He created the world, He created the stage, and then gave us the ability to operate within that stage and continue the work that He did. He did the Bria Yesh Me'ayin, and we're meant to continue within that Yesh Me'ayin Bria, continuing to develop, continuing to work through the tools of Malacha in order to create a more perfect world.
That is a great teaser. Make sure to tune back in next week for more fascinating conversations that touch on this topic and more. So I wanted to move on within the Pirushim that fit the Meiri's second approach, the idea that work is supposed to be loved even if you are a rich person who has a lot of money. So the Meiri himself actually says that the reason why you're supposed to love work even for a rich person is because boredom is really bad for your mental health. This is not just a psychological idea. It is quoted by the Mishna in Maseches Kesubos that says that boredom is really, really bad for a person's mental state. Therefore, even if a person doesn't need money, he should still be involved in something that will keep him busy and not have him be stuck with the awful fate of boredom. Also, if you look in the Rabbeinu Yonah and the Bartanura, they also quote similar ideas connecting this Mishnah to the Mishnah in Ksubas, which talks about how awful it is to be bored. Now, obviously, these two approaches have very different ideas of what a person should be doing when they work. According to the first idea, the Avos of Nasan, a person should really be striving to find something that develops the world, that creates a better society for the people around us, the world around us, the world at large. Whereas according to the Meiri, the Rabbeinu Yonah, the Bartanura, really anything goes. Any work that keeps you busy and helps you avoid boredom, even if it's just pushing papers, it's just clocking in and clocking out to do some menial task, menial labor, that would also be very important and should be loved according to the Beis HaBechira, according to the Rabbeinu Yonah, according to the Bartanura, because the idea is to work, to not be bored, to not be doing nothing. Whereas according to the Avos of Nasan, we should be striving to find work which is more meaningful and more effective in creating a better world and developing a better society. A second nafkamina might be someone who's able to sit and learn Torah. According to the Meiri, not everyone is able to sit and learn Torah all day. Not everyone has the Zitzfleisch to sit and find fulfillment and meaning in Torah learning day in, day out for their entire life. But if you are one of those people, and you could theoretically sit and learn Torah, so that person would probably not be subject to the dangers of shimum, of boredom, because he's being productive, just not in a sense of earthly, worldly work. Whereas according to Avos Rav Nassan, well, there still could be value for a Talmid Chacham who has potential to sit and learn, to go out and fulfill his obligation to have the bris of Shutvas of Kadosh Baruch Hu and Maaseh Bereishis to do a malacha that will make the world into a better place. And I did see this idea brought down in a number of Sfarim, and they connect it to the opinion of Rabbi Nehorai. Rabbi Nehorai, in the end of Maseches Kedushin, says that I am not going to teach my son any form of trade or secular knowledge. I'm only going to teach him Torah. So the Mefarshim explain that a Hovis HaMalacha is speaking to people who, if they don't go to work, they're going to sit around being bored. That's awful. That person must go to work. But if a person has the potential to sit and learn and learn and learn, and he's not going to go crazy, so that person doesn't have the same need to go to work as the other guy who's not able to learn. So what comes out is that most people need to work, not necessarily for the financial aspect, just to prevent the awful mental health aspects of being bored. But there are a few special individuals who have the potential to sit and learn Torah long term. And those people don't necessarily have the same imperative to love going to work because they're able to avoid boredom through their Torah learning.
So the point about Reb Nehorai is an interesting one. It would be worth exploring. Was Reb Nehorai saying that he only wanted his child to be osek in Torah only for his entire life? Or was he saying from his own responsibility as a parent, who, according to the earlier Gemara in Kedushin, has a chiyuv of teaching his son and umnus? Was he saying that I'm going to use my son's childhood to teach him Torah only, and then when he grows up, he's going to figure out what he's going to do to be mefarnas himself. Not that he's not going to have any sort of parnasa and be supported by public funds or whatever. The point is that I'm going to capitalize on this time, this valuable girsat diakas time, for him to be able to learn as much as possible. But of course, he's going to have to support himself at some point.
That is a great point. The Mefarshim there on the Gemara do discuss it, and these are all great conversations that we should find time to unpack properly. So let's just summarize where we're up to right now and then keep going forward. So we are within the Meiri's framing that this Mishnah might be talking even to a rich person, a person who does not necessarily need the money to put food on the table. He is supposed to love his work. So we saw the Avos of Nasan, who quoted the bris of Torah and the bris of Shabbos as being the source of this love. And then we saw the Meiri, the Rabbeinu Yonah, and the Bartanura, who talk about this in the context of avoiding boredom. And now I want to move on to one more explanation that ties in to this idea of loving work even if you're rich. The third approach is based off of a Gemara in Maseches Kedushin, where the Gemara talks about the various things that a father is obligated towards his son. And one of the things that is mentioned in the Mishnah is that the father has to teach his son a trade. What's the source for this? So the Gemara says in Kedushin of Lamed Beis, based on the pasuk in Koheles, which says, Re'ei chayim im isha asher ahavta. Says the Gemara, Im isha mameshi kishem shechayv lasio isha kach chayv lamdo umnos. Im Torah hi kishem shechayv lamdo Torah kach chayev l'lamdo umnos. But the pasuk had said, Re'ei chaim im isha asher ahavta. So we're either comparing work to the love that a person has for his spouse, or for the love a person has towards Talmud Torah. Now, I'm just not sure what to make of that. How do we compare a person's love towards his spouse versus a person's love towards his work? It's almost like a classic argument that spouses might get into. Like, you love me more than you love your work. So what's going on here? Do you have any suggestions about this?
So what comes to mind is the Gemara in Sota, the beginning of Sota says, Avayim Yom Kod the Mitziris of Vlad. The Baskel comes out and announces Bas Ploni Ploni. When it comes to marriage, even before a person is born, it's already been predetermined who his eventual spouse is going to be, right? There's this one person out there who's the perfect fit for him. I think that's part of what facilitates the ahava, the love relationship, is this exclusivity. So there's a really interesting section from Avos in the third barak of Shara Bitachon, where he talks about actually what sounds like something similar when it comes to a person's Milacha is Asika B'Yeshuvo Shel Olam. I think Rav Aaron Lapiansky brings down the section in Ben Torah for Life. The idea that he says there is, if you look at the natural world, you look at lions and tigers, you look at eagles. Each animal is built with the tools that it needs to get its parnasa. Take a cow, right? A cow survives on grass, so it's not easy to digest grass, and therefore they're built with 4 stomachs. And the whole process of chewing cud is to give the animal enough time for the grass to go into stomach number 1. If you learned Chulin recently, or is it the Omasam, or whatever the different stomachs are called, for the grass to go through each system enough times for it to actually be broken down and give the cow nutrients that it needs. So Hashem created the cow in such a way that it would be able to receive its parnasa. I think the Chosavava says Hashem created lions with the claws and the strength that it needs to be able to pounce on animals and tear them up and kill them and eat them that way. I think they say about birds, take like an eagle, right? So eagles flying, I don't know how many feet, thousands of feet up in the air, and it's able to see fish swimming underneath the surface of the water from miles up in the air. It's really unbelievable. Also recognizing that there's refraction, right? So usually when we look into water, the light bends as it enters the water. And if you've ever tried spearfishing, you'll know that part of the reason it's so difficult is because where you think the fish is, it's not actually there, because the light is bending and you're not seeing it accurately. So if I understand this correctly, I think the eyeballs of an eagle or certain birds are built in such a way that they calibrate for that refraction, and they actually are seeing fish in the right spot, so they can come down in this split-second swoop. They can grab fish out of the water and get back out of there. Really incredible the way that these animals are built. The Cuvier-beaked whales are able to dive thousands of feet under the surface. If you put a submarine down there, the entire thing would be folded up flat like a soda can, just because of the pressure. But apparently their lungs are able to fold up like the accordion. Lungs are able to fold up so they don't get crushed, allowing them to dive to such incredible depths. So if you look at the natural world, you see this all over the place. Animals are built in very unique ways in order to allow them to be harness themselves the way that they need to. So too people. The big takeaway from Avos is people as well. People are built with the traits, with the interests that they need in order to be mefarnes themselves. And even if, this is surprising, Avos says, even if a person sees that his parnasa is not putting food on the table, he's not making enough money to be able to be mefarnes himself from whatever he thinks his calling is, the Chosal Baba says it doesn't really matter. You're built in a certain way because Hashem wants you to do something specific, and He actually calls it the mitzvah of the ulashamra. An important lashon, fascinating lashon, the mitzvah of the ulashamra, and you have to be in osek in that trait and that parnasa, even if it's not actually putting food on the table. That's your job, that's your calling, that's how Hashem created you, based on the traits, the interests that you know that you have, based on that self-knowledge. You're meant to be osik in that. So I think the same way you're created with a spouse, creating that ahava relationship, you're also created with the tools that you need for a very specific malacha, a very specific trait.
So we now have 3 ideas that fit into this bucket of work even for the rich. Number 1, it's part of a covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu to develop the world. Number 2, it's a great way to avoid the horrors of boredom. And number 3, based on the pasuk Re'ei Chaim Ma'asher Shahavta, and maybe this connects to the Chovas Avos, which talks about a person's trade and profession being very, very exclusive to his own strengths and interests and his own personal situation. So I want to transition to the second part of this conversation, which is the second lens that the Meiri gave us, which is that maybe the Mishnah is talking not to a rich person, but to a poor person, someone who needs the money. That's why he's going to work. So what does it mean that for this person is supposed to love his work? So the Meiri himself makes reference to a Mamar Chazal, which appears in Brachos and Tavches and in other places, which says, Gadol hanene miyigia kapo yoter miyirei shemayim. That someone who works and sustains themselves based on their own efforts and their own labor is even greater than the Yarei Shemayim. Now, longtime Shark Tank listeners will remember our conversation with Rav Yoshua Pfeffer, who quoted this idea, and he also has an essay that he wrote about this topic, and we will link to it in the show notes, which says, why is it so great? Why is it greater than a Yarei Shemayim, someone who's able to be Nene Migia Kapo? And he says that we have a mitzvah, which we quoted earlier in this conversation, called V'halachta b'drachav, to go in the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the ultimate independent actor. He doesn't need anybody. He's not dependent on anybody. Therefore, everything he does is out of complete divine freedom. So within that framework, we too should strive to have that financial independence, which will create personal independence to do what it is that we see fit and not be dependent on tzedakah, not be dependent on others. I think that we can make a diuk that the Mishnah said, Ehoves hamalacha. It didn't say Ehoves malachtcha, love your job, love what you do, love your profession or your trade. It says, love the malacha, love the fact that you're able to do work and be financially independent. It could be that that is what the Mishnah means by Ehoves hamalacha, and that certainly fits with what the Meiri says, that this is all about Gadol hanena miyigia kapo yoter miyirei shemayim. It's about the fact that you're doing your own work and being financially independent.
Yeah, I think a Gemara that fits very nicely with the way you just said that is the Gemara in Avodah Zarah talks about the importance of being mefarnish yourself rather than being teleriel and tzibur. The Gemara says that a person should even be osek in Avodah Zarah. It's obviously a very shocking statement. The Gemara questions, could it possibly mean Avodah Zarah mamish? The Gemara says, no. It didn't mean really Avodah Zarah mamish. It meant you should be osek in avoda shezara lo, a work which is strange to you. Kedamar le Rav Kahana nitosh nevelta b'shuka ushkol agra v'lotem magavaraba ana v'zila b'milsa. Better for a person to do, let's say, a malacha b'zuya, to be osek in skinning or flaying an animal in the shuk and presumably selling the skin for money. Better to do that malacha, which is considered a not mechubad profession or not mechubad way to get money, rather than saying I'm a gavarabba, I'm a chashuv person. The zila b'milsa, it's not befitting my kavod to do something like that. So the idea that it's not specifically loving your malacha, but the idea of malacha in general and the opportunity that it provides to be self-sufficient, I think is exactly what this Gemara is saying. Now, on the one hand, you have a malacha which is zaralo and avoda which is not zaralo. There's work which is kind of fitting your sharash haneshama, and avoda which is strange to that. But still, what we're meant to almost focus on, or at least see as a b'diavad, is the idea that malacha in general, even malacha which is zaralo, is still important because of the self-dignity that it creates by not having to be totally alachir.
So I want to say two things about that. The first is that the connection between our Mishnah of Ehov es HaMalacha and the Mamar Chazal in Pesachim and in other places, which says Pshot Nevelta Bashuka Va'al Tistarach Labrios, is made by the Mefarish, the commentary which is attributed to Rashi in Pirkei Avos, and he makes that connection as well. But the second thing that I want to think about here is the fact that in this specific Mamar Chazal, if you read between the lines and you read it carefully, it seems to be clear that really there are much better jobs out there than these dirty jobs of being Pshot Nevelta Bashuka. The Gemara tells us that if your only two options are not having any work at all and being completely destitute or completely dependent on others, so then the dirty job would be better. But it's mashma from here. It seems to indicate that this is really not such a great job, and there really are much better jobs out there. And in that context, I want to try to understand, what does it mean to be loving your work? So you suggested one possibility, that maybe you're not loving the job, you're loving the fact that you're able to work and be financially independent. But there could be another explanation that fits in here very nicely, which is Rav Schwab in his Sefer Mein Beis HaShoeva on Parshas Vayetze talks about the fact that Leah felt hated, snu'ah, in the eyes of Yaakov. And he asked the question, is it really possible that Yaakov Avinu hated Leah? Rather, he suggests, alternatively, to explain that really he loved Leah and he loved Rachel more. And when we talk about love and hate, so really the one that you love the most is what you love, and everything else is the hate. So it could be here that we could flip that on the other side and say, really, both of these options are not so great, but the best option you have is what you should love, because that's really what you need to do. You need to choose the best option you have in front of you and love that, because that's among the options you have. It's the best possible, right? Why you shouldn't be jealous of things that are going on. Other people have better jobs. Okay, you have two options right now. You take the best one and you love that. So it could be that similar to the way Rav Schwab understands the dynamic between Yaakov and Rachel and Leah. The Ahava and the Sinna there is really just all about the relativity of the different relationships. So too here, when you have the best possible option, that's what you should go with. And you should love the fact that you have the best option and don't have to go to the worst option.
I'll just say that I actually have skinned an animal before, and it's not that bad. It's something you could get used to. It's not. It's a little gross. Take some elbow grease, literal elbow grease to get the skin off. The issue might be more the shuk aspect than the pshat and delta. But yeah, the mice itself is not necessarily disgusting. You can get used to it. Maybe it's the shuk context. Just wanted to throw in that I have had the opportunity to pshat and delta before. Actually, not a nevela. It was a kosher shchita.
So within the second part of this conversation, we've seen that loving your work could be loving the fact that you're financially independent. Gadol hanen migi kapav. We suggested that maybe love is just a relative term if it's the best possible option, even if it's a malacha bezuya. And finally, the third interpretation that fits into this bucket is that idea which is quoted by the Ritva, also by Tiferes Yisrael, says something similar, which is that really this Mishnah is just an Eitzah Tova. It's a piece of good advice. If you want to be able to continue to show up day after day in doing a job, it is very helpful to have a love for it, have some sort of satisfaction and enjoyment that you get out of it, and that will help you do the job that you need to do for more practical and pragmatic reasons. There's a very interesting way that the Tiferes Yisrael quotes this idea. He says, go down to a port and see the workers that need to schlep these really, really heavy cargo on and off the boats. And he says, you'll see that they're whistling or singing while they work, right? The famous song, Whistle While You Work. Why? It's meant to make the work easier, not to give the work some sense of transcendental meaning and some deep, passionate love and affection. No. You need to get the job done. So by loving the job, you will be more effective at being able to show up day after day and do what you need to do and get the job done.
Right. Nowadays, they talk about the idea of entering the flow state, right, where time seems to fly by, and you're so involved and you're so focused on what you're doing that you don't even realize that time is passing. You're enjoying it so much. That sounds to be almost exactly what maybe more the Ritva is explaining. You want to be able to find something where you can enter that flow state and be fully invested, fully involved in what you're doing. And that would be kind of the ideal malacha for a person to be involved in.
So now I would like to review the 6 ideas that we've quoted on the Mishnah so far, and then we'll transition to do a few parting thoughts. So we had these 2 frames, 2 subjects of the Mishnah. Is the Mishnah telling a rich person or telling a poor person to love their work? So if you assume that it's a rich person, so we quoted 3 ideas. Number 1, the Avos of Nasan, who says there's a bris of Melacha, just like there's a bris of Shabbos, and just like there's a bris of Torah. Number 2, Rabbeinu Yonah, the Bar Tanura, said that boredom is bad, and you have to do everything you can to avoid boredom. And number 3, the Gemara in Kiddushin, Re'ei Chaim Hashashar Ahavta, similar to the idea of the Chovos HaLevavos, which talks about the very intimate and exclusive relationship each person has with their profession. Then we talked about the poor person's idea of loving your work. We had Gadol Hanen Migi Kapav, the importance of being financially independent. We had Pshot Nevelta Bashuk of Al-Starach Labrios, which could be they're supposed to love whatever best option you have, even if it's not objectively so great and so clean and maybe a melacha bezuya. And finally, we said there's a practical advantage to loving what you work. It makes it easier for you to show up and do what you have to do day after day in order to continue to put food on the table. So now let's do a few parting thoughts. Rav Tzvi, what are your parting thoughts on this conversation?
I think it's important to keep in mind these 2 sides of Avos of Malacha. On the one hand, there's the importance of the parnasa that Malacha provides. Let's say the Meiri's poor men take, and the importance of the independence, the importance of the imitat Yodei of Malach B'Drachav that Malacha facilitates. At the same time, recognizing that there is a second side, and I think it's the second side which often gets missed or downplayed I think, like you said before, especially with the challenges of parnasa, to recognize that there is an inherent value in the malacha that you do. I forget what the stats are. I think people say that you spend some like 60% of your adult life involved in career, involved in work. So to recognize that you have the choice to find something which is, let's say, making that contribution to your community, to society at large, depending on the talents, the skills that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you, and to think deeply about the choices that you're making and how you're going to be using that time in the most productive way, in a way that you can actually feel proud and say that I am bohev es malachti. I actually do love my work. I appreciate the value that I bring, not just in the fact that it allows me to put food on the table, but that I actually feel like I'm contributing in some major way. In Chutz La'aretz, that can be true in a number of professions. In Eretz Yisrael, there's that famous Tassim Sofer that talks about how almost everything that you do to contribute to the economy in Eretz Yisrael is inherently valuable as part of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, as opposed to just Yishuvo Shalom. But to recognize this inherent value and to think, what are the skills, what are the talents, what are the interests that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me that I'm meant to be tapping in on? And even if that's not going to be your full-time profession, to look for outlets, to look for opportunities, to use those skills, to use those talents in order to let's say, actualize, or let's say this way, like the Chosel Vavos Lashon, to be Mekayim that mitzvah of the Lashon.
Yeah, those are really important points. And just to pick up on that stat of how much time people spend on work is actually one of the things that really drove me to start this podcast in the first place. You know, if work is such a central feature of our lives, so much of our time and our energies and our blood, sweat, and tears go into our work. So it really was important for me to really understand what the Torah's approach is and to really understand what the Torah's values are with regards to work. And Aaron Lapiansky makes an interesting point in his book, Ben Torah for Life, also just based on that stat, where he says that misvara, it's absurd to assume that work, which takes up so much of our time and our energy in our life, could be just a technical means to put food on the table. He says it just doesn't make sense, and there has to be some more Torah value to work based off of the fact that work takes up so much of our time. So that's an interesting approach as well. And as far as my final thought on this conversation, I want to actually go back to the very first thing that we quoted, which was an article by a professor in Bar Ilan, where she quoted the different approaches of thinkers and business leaders about loving your work and how much we're supposed to love our work and how much we can expect to get a sense of pleasure and joy and fulfillment from our workplace. And I think that it's important, you know, based on what we saw today in our conversation, to have that conversation within the Torah world as well, because we have our own value system, and it's called the Torah. And the Torah also has different approaches, Shivim Panim LaTorah. And so we saw here that even within this one Mishnah, 3 words has all these different approaches with different nafkaminas and different ideas that come out of them and questions that can be asked. And all the things that we said today can be discussed and challenged and debated. And I think it's just important for people, as we just mentioned, that spend so much time at their work should invest in understanding and grappling with what the proper place of work should be and developing a healthy hashkafa around our approach to work. Thanks so much for listening. Coming up next week on Monday, we have a fascinating conversation with one of Israel's leading venture capitalists, who also happens to be a big Talmid Chacham. And we also have a fascinating conversation coming up on Thursday about one of the most famous Mishnayos with regards to Torah and working. So stay tuned for that. Until next week, keep on steiging, Chevra.